Director of Data Science at the National Institutes of Health, where he led the Big Data to Knowledge program, coordinating access to and analyzing biomedical research from across the globe and making it available to scientists and researchers. At NIH, Dr. Bourne was also responsible for governance and strategic planning activities for data and knowledge management and established multiple trainings in data science. Dr. Bourne, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm disappointed that we can't have a lot of heckling during the presentation, but please make sure you heckle at the end. Because there's, I much prefer that kind of interaction these days. I'm too old to be giving endless talking head talks. You can look them up on YouTube. This is a little different than certainly what I talked to you about before, and there's some, I guess, evolving differences based on what I'm doing now. So let me start with a bit of a disclaimer. This is not a talk about my own research. It's more a talk about the general even the general principles, but aspects of data science that I think are relevant, certainly to biomedicine, and hopefully you can see relevance in what you're doing. I'll also throw in a few NIH sort of tidbits that may not be as up to date as they were certainly when I left, although I have to say that Francis Collins came down to visit not that long ago. And just yesterday I got back from a meeting at Hopkins of CD2H, which is the coordination for the CTSAs that relates to data and I guess data science. So I saw old friend program officers there, so I got a lot of inside information.
The conference has been unmuted.
Anyway.
The conference has been unmuted.
A year now at UVA, developing work that Don Brown and Alan Burgess has started on the Data Science Institute, and I'll say a little about that. So really, I guess I'm going to give you the take-homes already, so you could actually go and get the pizza once you've had this, because you'll have all you'll remember anyway, which is effectively increased awareness of how aspects of data science might impact your own activities, increased awareness of where the NIH is headed, and some thoughts about within your own organization and organizations that you represent, how you might build data science into your environments. So that's what I hope to get across. The interesting thing, of course, is no one really knows what data science is. But it's sort of like the internet. If I asked each one of you, you would say something different, and yet you use it every day. And of course, whether you like it or not, you're affected by developments in data science now. And it's just, I think, going to get more and more profound. So from my point of view, what we're talking about here today, and I think this also sort of speaks to some of the drivers, which we'll get to in a bit more detail, is when I came to talk to you before, I had a real focus on open science. I'm going to touch on that today, but that's not clearly really the major focus, although it undoubtedly influences what's happening. Because the driver here, more than anything else, is the availability of more and more open, complex, and diverse digital data. And that's clearly the driving force behind these developments. And we'll get to how that's affecting things in a minute. What's really interesting is how, I'm going to give you a little story in a second just to illustrate why I'm enjoying myself so much, whether whether it resonates with you will remain to be seen. But it's about looking at combining data sets from diverse sort of places, statistically significant conclusions that are not otherwise obtainable, and that's a critical aspect, sharing and then translating into something meaningful, which is going to improve the situation for patients. So here's I thought you were asking a question. You're not allowed to. I understand. Okay. So let me give you a little story that happened that I think just reflects where things are headed. So a trauma surgeon from the health system at UVA came to see me and said, I've been doing trauma surgeries for 20 years. Quite often, of course, they're the result of car accidents. And when the patient, if the patient survives, and I at some point get to talk to them, I find out more about the kind of accident they've been in. And knowing what I know about the patient and how they were treated, and then I go back and look in an electronic health record, I started to make these mental correlations between the type of accident that they had and the type of injuries they received. I got interested enough in this is his words, that I went to the DMV where I could actually publicly get access to a whole set of crash-related data. We actually use this in our own capstone project, so, by the way. That I then taught myself a little Python and R, and I tried to actually analytically come up with these correlations. My motivation for doing this is that when someone shows up at the ER, if we could have a better sense of the kind of internal injuries they had by knowing the nature of the accident they were in, it might actually save us some time and ultimately save some lives. So I thought that, from my sort of naive point of view, I thought that was really cool for a couple of reasons. First of all, which is really the business of data science, it puts together disparate data sets that people would not necessarily think about putting together. EHR data, DMV data. Just the fact that he went to the DMV, it just deserves a medal. But in any case, and then the fact that this is someone that's coming out of a grassroots effort where people see this promise and they're willing to learn themselves some technologies to do it. So I thought that was, that's really an exemplar for the kind of thing. And we're actually engaged on that, and I'll get to this when I talk about the Data Science Institute. But we're engaged in this kind of behavior, enabling this kind of behavior. So, as I said, the drivers here, I think, cause and effect. There's a huge amount of digital data that's now available, and it's essentially doubling every 2 years. This is not just in biomedicine, this is across the board, but it's true in biomedicine as well. So obviously it's coming from $1,000 genomes, wearable sensors, mandatory HRs, and so on. The tools themselves are not new, but for the most part there are some developments. I'll say just a little about this. This is not a detailed lecture about machine learning. But what's important is those tools are working better by virtue of having much more training data than we ever had before. And that's what we're seeing in just about every manifestation of data science. And then that's possible because we have new computing power that's derived primarily from graphical processing units. So it's really those three things that is sort of having, I think, a pretty perturbing effect on a variety of different businesses. We don't obviously just deal with healthcare. We deal much more broadly than that. And more companies will tell you that they are now data companies, and they work in that mode. We work quite a lot with Capital One, which is, I think, the biggest employer of UVA graduates, and they would say that they're completely in the cloud and they're completely a data analytics company now. That's what they do for a business. So the result of all of that, of course, is that it is a big business. There's the potential to save resources, which drives things forward. As a result of that, there's really supply and demand are really out of whack. So the number of unfilled jobs, the number of people who are qualified to work in this space relative to the number of open jobs is really out of proportion. It means that our students, we have not placed a student yet in the 4 years of a Master's in Data Science program that we've been running. And virtually all of them get signing bonuses and really pretty high salaries. The idea that this doesn't perturb the market to go and become a graduate student and then to go on and do a postdoc at really miserable wages when you can do an 11-month master's program and come out of that and going out and make, in one case last year, $160K out of the box, that's pretty compelling. So I think that's something to worry about. And, as I say, we've got lots of applicants for what we're doing. I think what's interesting about this is that the value of what's going on, I would say, is undervalued by virtue of we see this very large growth in data, but we're not actually investing that much more. We are in people, but not in IT growth to in most organizations to deal with it. I've now had 3 meetings with the president-elect of UVA, and each time I've tried to get across that the university is going to be a different place going forward, and it's going to be more data-driven than it's ever been before, and we really ought to be doing something about it. And that means spending more on IT and other things, and the rest are sort of fairly obvious. What about the NIH per se, and how this kind of change, what is the thinking within NIH? So just a couple of points. When I was there, Francis Collins asked me, how much data do we actually have? And I said, Francis, I have absolutely no idea. But then I tried to make an estimate. So it was how much data are we actually supporting and funding. So what I could do is I could go around the intramural program, and I could go to literally 50 different data centers within the intramural program of NIH, which tells you something straight away. We'll talk about that in a moment. And I could estimate how much data they had, and then knowing that that's about 17% or whatever it is now of the NIH budget, I could extrapolate and come up with a number of 650 petabytes, of which only 3% of that is actually within resources we use all the time, namely NCBI at the National Library of Medicine. What's even more disturbing is, well, that's a lot of data. That's sort of how do we sustain that, and how do we sustain it when it's doubling every 2 years, and how do we make the most of it? These are all sort of open questions, really. It's costing quite a lot, at least as the NIH look at it. But what's also disturbing is that NLM did a study where they looked at all the papers in PubMed Central for 1 year. They extracted all of the data sets, referenced all of the data sets that were referenced in those published papers, and then went to try and get the data. Only 12% of the data could they actually get hold of. So 88% of that data was dark data, which means, maybe it's available for the investigators if you ask for it, and maybe they won't give it to you, but that they're in some senses required to do that by the data sharing agreements. But it really affects certainly reproducibility of science going forward. So I can tell you that these are significant concerns within the NIH, and I still talk to a number of the directors about the progress that's going on, and these concerns remain. Just a couple of examples, things you may know about that are going on, big projects within the NIH, and in fact how they're influenced by data science to some extent. So just before I do that, let me just give you this picture. This is a picture I got from that Francis gave to me. When I first went to NIH, I'd only been there about 2 months, and Francis came to me and said, I want you to write a brief that's an intersection between genomics, big data, precision medicine for the president. And when he said that, I said, the president of what? He said POTUS, and I have to say that this is how naive I was when I went to government. I thought POTUS was a society I hadn't heard of, so I actually went to look it up, and I realized, oh, it's that president. Okay, so anyway, this is I'm not saying that in the end, by the time what I wrote, probably not one word persisted in what the president finally read, but anyway, it did lead to obviously a significant funding initiative, which last weekend was essentially open generally to the public to actually participate and be part of a 1 million patient cohort. I just really had to show this because frankly, it scares the hell out of me. So I don't know, you probably recognize as many, if not more of these people than I do, but just a few of them, not to go through the list. John Holdren, National Science Advisor at the time, Francis Collins, Eric Lander, who was the chair of PCAS, which is a committee for science and technology that advised the president, Sylvia Burwell, head of HHS, and a series of other folks. None of those essentially exist anymore. There is a secretary of HHS, but there's no PCAS, there's no STP, no OSTP, there's no National Science Advisor. This doesn't worry you. It should. It worries me. Anyway, these are all projects that have elements. I won't go into a lot of them, but there's, just to give you an example, a couple of examples perhaps. So MODS is the model organism databases that have existed for a long time. There's some question now about how they should persist into the future. So this is valuable data, there's no question about it. Genomic information, in particular, on a variety of model organisms, fly, rat, yeast, and so on, mice. But there's a desire to integrate that, because that's really what the research requires today. So instead of having these disparate resources spread around that all evolve differently, these groups have been pulled together to try and create a singular view across multiple species. Also looking at automated curation so that these things can scale against the size of the data sets they're growing. And then each one of these projects, which I won't go into, is characterized by the various aspects of what's important in data science, which I'll say something about. Platforms and integration, examples, machine learning, curation, these are all aspects of data science that are really critical. So just to so the question is, what does the future hold in this regard? And I actually showed this at to the advisory board, to the director of NIH while I was still at NIH. And it's based on concept of Peter Diamandis, who came up with this idea of 6 Ds it's an exponential framework. It's actually described in this book. So the 6 Ds are shown here, and I'm going to illustrate why this. I use this as an attempt to scare the leadership of NIH as to potential possibilities. So the first step, of course, is digitization. So that is really, when you have exponential growth of digital content, this is, in principle, what can happen. So, and I'll illustrate this with a specific example that has nothing to do with healthcare or basic or clinical research, but I think is quite useful. So when you're in this phase of exponential growth, when you're low on the growth curve, it's what you call the deceptive phase, because no one really appreciates how quickly things are changing. People feel like they can ignore it. And the classic case of ignoring it was what Kodak did when they invented the digital camera. They basically ignored it. They shelved it in deference to their chemical business because they didn't see any need to actually develop it at that time. Meanwhile, the number of pixels in a camera and the number of digital photographs was increasing during this deceptive phase until we got to this point, the third D, of disruption, when you hit the inflection point on the exponential curve. And then, of course, that's actually when Kodak effectively went bankrupt. But then what's interesting in this marketplace is other completely different things happened. There was a sort of demonetization, certainly with respect to cameras. There was a dematerialization and a democratization. So the end of all of that was a business model, for example, Instagram, which had a value proposition that was greater than Kodak's was at any of its points in its life, but was actually a business that was completely different than what we started with. So, the question is, if we are seeing this digitization occurring in healthcare at an exponential rate, is it going to in any way perturb the system? I don't know. I just illustrate this one example. And there are obviously clearly many differences in how these businesses operate, but I think it's definitely something worth thinking about. And I'm convinced myself, of course, that there's going to be quite distinctive aspects of the 6 Ds that will come into play, and we can talk about that later. Part of this is that this, from the point of view of the government, when they see this, of course, is they introduce all these mandates to make as much of this data available as possible, even if it's going to be disruptive. In one level, they want to be disruptive. Francis used to say to me, don't use the word disruptive, it frightens bureaucrats. But, it's basically what's potentially happening. But, there's also arguments that open data actually makes a lot of difference. So just as a trivial example, we just ran just a month or two ago with the North Virginia Technology Council. We did a suicide prevention hackathon. So we got a whole bunch of students from UVA, as from other institutions in the state, to actually hack at public suicide data that's available. UVA actually won this competition. There were two sort of supported findings, which are probably to some degree intuitive, but certainly was supported by data analysis. One, that suicide rates normalized are higher in rural areas than they are in urban areas because there's not the support mechanisms. And second, that there's a correlation with gun laws in a given state as to the number of suicides that occur. And in fact, the rate of suicide over the nation is twice, among vets, is twice what it is in the rest of the population. So this is just bringing public data to bear on this problem. It got enough, these are first-year freshman students who did these analyses, which, you know, it's another thing that it tells you. How many people here know what a Raspberry Pi is? Few, okay, good. So I was telling the current president of UVA that we were talking about, you know, the future, and I was saying, you know, these kids are going to come, they can build their own. The Raspberry Pi are these components, it's like Lego for computers, right? You can build all sorts of systems from it. So these kids are doing all this stuff, and others are doing it too. I mean, we're not necessarily kids. And, you know, it's changing. This is what we need to be faced with as we teach. But there's sort of other aspects of, I'm just going to make a further case for openness, and this is one I used. So that was public data that came from various places, including the VA, who did the suicide study. This is, in my view, where something can go wrong. So this is a study of diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, which many of you probably know is a rare pediatric brain cancer, with very poor outcomes. The survival rates are actually very poor. So the median survival was only 9 to 12 months after diagnosis. So, and radiotherapy and chemotherapy are not in any way effective. In 2012, there was actually a study that identified a recurrent driver mutation. There was nothing that people could really do about that, and the data was not with that particular mutation. Those investigators hung on to that data for 3 years before it was actually publicly released. That then led to, including from their own study, I think, because the group that actually took their data and started doing stuff with it actually collaborated with them. But they actually identified, both groups together in the publication that identified ACVR1, which is a targetable tyrosine kinase that was already in clinical trials. As there was a known inhibitor. That was then tried against about 60 of these patients who actually exhibit this particular mutation. And in fact, you know, it's had some lasting effects. I mean, how effective it will be in the long term is another matter altogether. But the fact is that, you know, you could do this, because it's such a rare disease, the number of patients it actually affects, you could make these kinds of statements about if this data had been available 3 years earlier, it might have saved lives earlier on. The point is that, you know, this data was not available, so there's this push for open data. So how do you push you know, institutions to be more open with respect to what they do? Because openness is all about, more than anything else, about culture change. And these are just some examples of things that we're instigating. When I came here to UVA, I tried to push the idea of open UVA. Changing a whole institution, you can imagine how well that went. However, we are in a very large growth phase at the Data Science Institute, thanks to hopefully what will be a very large gift. If this was to come off, it would be, please don't spread it around too much, but would be the biggest single gift that UVA has ever got. That would allow the Data Science Initiative to really accelerate, and we would I would push very hard to declare ourselves as an open institute, or whatever it is we become. This is not a new concept. The Montreal Neurosciences Institute has declared themselves an open institute, and they have a set of principles by which they operate, which is reflective of these things, some of these things I'm showing you here. One, of course, is to identify yourself uniquely within the system so you can be attributed in a digital world. So that's where this ORCID ID. How many people here have ORCID IDs? Okay. In many journals now, you can't actually deposit a paper without giving them your ORCID ID. But maybe not in the journals that most of you publish in, I guess. Something to think about. While I was at the NIH, I really pushed on the whole idea of preprints. These are common in other fields like physics, not so common in the life sciences. That's actually happening. Now, they are now permitted as part of grant applications and annual reports. And I wouldn't like to predict what will happen in the future, but I'd like to see that these become mandatory so that work gets out there. We can have a long argument about this. Pre-reviewed that is available to the community on completion. In all of the things I observed with the directors around the directors table at NIH when I presented the notion of encouraging preprints to all of the directors. Afterwards, Francis said to me, "In all the time I've been here, this was the least contentious directors meeting we've ever had." So there was a lot of support for this. So I think this will get implemented quite broadly. So other things, I don't have to go through this list necessarily. Open access, that was one of the things I've talked to you about in the past. Recognize openness in hiring and promotion and tenure.
The conference has been muted.
Institutional openness. We now actually have a Wikimedian in residence at UVA. His name's Lane Raspberry, sits actually with us in the Data Science Institute. Wikidata is the fastest growing piece of the Wikimedia Foundation enterprise. They are integrating lots of data with lots of other aspects of what they do, including Wikipedia. So it's going to become, I think, a very powerful tool that's data-based rather than, if you like, knowledge-based in the case of Wikipedia. And then various other things. So all of this is sort of pushing the NIH strategic plan for data. So both the National Library of Medicine and NIH writ large have actually recently put out for comment, which is now closed in both cases. And I think in the NLM's case, it's already been analyzed and put forward. But for what should happen in the future. So they're seriously thinking about what to do going forward with around data. This will impact grants. It will impact all aspects of NIH operation. So an example that I don't know if it's actually been out already, but right now data management, data accessibility is a data management plan is required on all NIH grants over 500K direct. But not on smaller grants, which of course is totally stupid. But that is either has changed. I don't know if it has changed because I haven't written an NIH grant for a while. But if it hasn't changed, it's going to change. So, and those plans themselves are generally pretty useless because no one really, you can say anything, it doesn't get reviewed. They're going to become a serious part of the review process. So, folks engaged with what you're doing, they should be thinking about this and what the implications are. Okay, so I won't go into all those details. Part of what they're suggesting is the notion of platforms that really are more open and more accessible. Because if you think about what we have now, and data presumably that you use off the internet, it's really siloed. It's a notion of being in pipes. So it's not easily integratable. You'll see in a minute that when I describe one of the aspects of data science, it's all about data engineering or wrangling, which is really about 80 or 90% of the effort. So huge amounts of effort go in to actually putting data sets together that come from disparate sources, where it's very hard to reproduce what someone else has done, and so on. There's efforts to address that through underlying technological infrastructure. And recently, maybe I didn't do anything. Oh, yeah. So recently, Vivian Benazzi, who worked with me at the NIH, we wrote a paper which was called Will Biomedical Research Become More Like Airbnb? And if you think about, that sounds stupid, I know, I can see you thinking it's stupid, but the basic notion is, if you think about Airbnb, you've got someone who wants, let's say, a room, so you've got a demand, and then you've got a supplier, someone who wants to rent a room. And all Airbnb is, or Uber, any of these things, is a very simplistic platform that allows that transaction to take place in a way that it tries to be secure and trusted. Right? So that's, if you think about it, you could go through any stage of what we do in biomedical research, and the same thing goes on. There's a supplier and a consumer. You know, at one end, when you write a grant, you are the supplier, and the government, whoever it is, or the foundation, is the provider. And then there's that piece, and then you can go all the way down. You could go through, you know, the data, the reagents you get. You know, there's a supplier and a consumer, all the way down to the data you produce. There's a supplier, and then you have to put it according to a data management plan. There's you're the provider, and there's a supplier through some database. So, but all of those layers are completely disparate from each other. So there's no connection from it. The data, right now, the data is not connected to the papers that you publish. We just saw that only 12% of it was actually in some way recoverable. So the idea that you get rid of these separate stovepipes of the research life cycle and you put them together more, conceptually, of course, just makes a lot of sense. And so just think about how that would work in one simple instance. There's a push now towards data citation. That has implications. It starts to say that citing the data set, first of all, it attributes people who work hard on a data set, but it also has the potential, at least, to give them some credit. So you've got that piece of it, but you've got a formal data citation, and then you've got a paper citation. So these can become part of the citation network, which means I could be looking at a paper, and it cites not another paper necessarily, it cites a data set. And then that data set itself cites several other papers, it's part of the network that have actually used that data set. That's really, to me at least, very valuable thing to know. It's really good to know if I'm going to go out and invest some time in taking this public data set, that X other papers or not have actually used that same data set. That tells me something about its value off the bat. So that's what the idea of creating, I could go in, NIH has created the notion of a commons to support this notion of platforms. I'm not going to talk to you any more about that because I want to get onto the data science piece. But I spent a lot of time on that commons when I was at NIH. And currently it's about, I don't know, a $50 million trial program. But if you know, the platform itself is no good without the emerging analytics. And they will likely have, in my view, potentially significant impact in the way that they have in many other industries. That's some irony here, is that academia is pretty way behind in using some of these analytical techniques. In fact, you know, they're now finding their ways from the private sector back into academia, is my observation. What do they mean exactly? Well, there's a lot of hype and discussion around machine learning. So really, that's come into play. I already said this in a sense, but the amount of data for training is why these techniques primarily have got better. There have been some advances in algorithmic efficiency. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but and obviously the hardware's improved. But you know, ultimately, it's really the data that's available for learning, and the fact that more people are doing this because they see commercial value in it, and that's feeding back into the academic system. So, but there are different kinds of work that's going on in machine learning, and I just want to sort of highlight two aspects of this. One is causal modeling, and then there's this one, which is prediction, which have, I think these are subtly different, and it's important to think about what the implications are for these. So these are just a few examples. There are many examples, but Google looked at this particular first case from 120,000 images, which were classified by 54 ophthalmologists, and this became by actually using that classification as a learning system. It was possible to actually detect the condition with as well as the ophthalmologists themselves. So these are classic examples of where machine learning has had a lot of influence, particularly in image recognition. And I just heard on NPR yesterday that there are now systems that are being sold where facial recognition is actually real time. So, and it's not just facial recognition, it's when someone is wearing a hat, glasses, is stooped, is looking in a different direction. These recognition, by virtue of learning from larger and larger data sets, are actually doing much better. So the prediction in this case is the image of the retina to outputs a diagnosis of the condition. It's really a closed system in many ways. It does not consider co-founders, so this is just a purely predictive tool that has laws of probability that can be defined for it. All the required information, if you like, is in the data. I mean, you can certainly expand out on this, but in the simplest case, it's a closed system. So that's what defines a predictive system. Examples of that, here's one I like a lot that's actually now 4 years old, but it's really just predicting based on, and it just shows the value of large amounts of data. So it's taking all of the electronic health records from the whole population of Denmark over a period of almost 15 years, and it's just looking at within that for particular disease states. All it's doing is creating a network. So if you have COPD, the chances you're going to advance to a condition of respiratory failure is pretty high, as reflected by the thickness of this edge in the network. So this is just an example of straight-out prediction. So it's a closed system. There's inputs and there are outputs, which is in this case the network itself. But it's a useful tool, and you can of course drill down on this. So what they're doing, as I understand it now, because of the nature of how things operate in Denmark, you can actually overlay socioeconomic data on this, and you can start looking at different effects that has on the network and how the network breaks down in accordance with other factors, which is useful. But the predictor, is there are many co-founders, and so when you have co-founders, it really requires. So the question is, people worry about, well, how's this going to impact healthcare? It just means that everything potentially, the ethical considerations, but how much is going to be done by machine and how much is going to be done by humans? When you have co-founders, and I'll give you examples of what co-founders are in a second in a particular case, that leads to the notion of causal inference, which requires this expert input. And then the question is, does enough expert knowledge, itself biased in a complex system built into an algorithm, provide accurate outcomes? So can you actually, if you have enough input into the understanding of the co-founders, does that then become a predictive system? And the answer is basically, for the majority of things that we do, no. Will it ever? Certainly not for a long time. So, but there's a certain paradox in all of this, which sort of speaks to when you have these co-founders and you try and allow for them, you have to be very careful. And this is where the expert comes in. So here's an example for the Birthweight Paradox. So what's the causal effect of smoking during pregnancy? Well, it's very hard to actually get an answer to that question because there are many co-founders. For example, whether the patient, whether the pregnant mother is consuming alcohol, what the diet's like, what kind of prenatal care they have. So how do you adjust for those co-founders? Without expert knowledge, you can certainly make significant mistakes. So, for example, if you actually consider birthweight as a co-founder, but birthweight's associated with infant mortality and maternal smoking. So it actually introduces bias into that system for which you're trying to measure. So one of the predictive outcomes for that would be potentially that lower birth weight babies from mothers who smoke during pregnancy leads to lower mortality. So you have to be really careful about how you apply these confounders, and that's why network knowledge and expert knowledge in these systems is so important. So here's just examples of the kind of data. I took this out of a recent paper from the folks at Harvard Medical School, and it's probably an interesting, easy read if you're interested in any more of this. So, a description. This is essentially trying to do predictive and causal inference from electronic health records. So, there's a description over here. The question: what proportion of women aged 60 to 80 had a stroke last year? And what's the probability of having a stroke next year for women with certain characteristics? So these are just methodologies that apply to that in a predictive system. And then this is, causal inference adds a lot of other co-founders into it. So we're starting a statin reduce on average the risk of stroke. There's lots of co-founders associated with that that one would have to take into account, including things like pharmacogenomics. So, and these are the kinds of methods that you use in these kind of things. But there's no question that they're starting to have some, at least with the computer type people in healthcare, having some impact. So if I think translating all of these kinds of developments into actually decision making in the clinic is for the most part, is quite a way away. But there are certainly efforts to do that. I was just, I think I mentioned, I was at the CTSA CD2H, which is the data coordinating effort for the CTSAs yesterday. And there's really efforts to sort of pull this together and really a push to try and get these methodologies, at least some of them, into the hands of people who can actually use them effectively. So if you accept that there's the amount of value you can argue about, but if you accept that there's some value in all of this, how do you, us as an institution, and how I'm here basically to push the Data Science Institute and how it might integrate with what you're doing. So as you perhaps know, the Data Science Institute operates across the campus at UVA. So we have people, as I already gave you the example of the trauma surgeon. So people come from all over the place. And there's just a whole bunch of really interesting projects going on where these folks come together. And so we also run capstone projects, and we'd really be interested to have our students work with some of the projects that you're doing. Certainly, areas of image recognition and analysis is an example. So we're all, just to sort of say how that might work, we're organizing ourselves around, I would say, 5 core verticals. And you might be able to see how in any one or more of these verticals there could be value with respect to what you're doing. So data acquisition is an example. We're now working quite closely with the Artificial Pancreas Project and other diabetes-related initiatives. And we're now broadening that out more broadly into biosensors more generally. I mentioned the data integration and engineering piece of it, the so-called data wrangling, just the analytics piece, which includes machine learning. And then there's visualizing and dissemination, which is, if any of these things are going to have value in the clinic, this is a key piece. We spend a significant amount of time helping students actually visualize and disseminate what it is they're doing. And then I haven't talked about the last part, which in many ways is the most important, which is the ethical the law and policy implications that go with this. So So that's sort of a set of 5 verticals. And then, you can imagine touch points with various areas of biomedicine across, across all of those. And I'll just give you quickly some examples of that. Obviously, data acquisition relates to imaging. There's a lot of interest in engaging us in that. We're doing a little work in that already. And I mentioned some of the other things. Data integration and engineering is sort of the piece that most people don't want to deal with, but it turns out to be critical. How you describe the data, what kinds of ontologies you use to represent the data, the idea of how data can be findable. We work on this principle, what's called the FAIR principle, which is the ability to find, access, interoperate, and reuse data. Indexing schemes and so on are part of all of that, and so on. And then machine learning, these are a whole series of projects that the students have undertaken this year. And I don't want to necessarily go into them, but there's a variety of things. And I think I only show this to illustrate that there could be value in having capstone projects with what you're doing here. So the students come, these are master students, so it's an 8-month program. They come, they work, they have mentors within the Data Science Institute. They work with you on your specific problems. And then there's periodically, every week or two, the group gets together to discuss progress and so on. So it's a way of inducing data science expertise into your projects in a way that's very inexpensive. And the students get the practical knowledge. And quite often, those students then go on to be employed by the group that actually hired them for the capstone. There's a whole bunch of things going on around visualization, dissemination. Virtual reality comes into that. We're actually using sound to try and working with the music department to try and understand how we can use different kinds of sensors to recognize different kinds of data. I can try and dig into some of these things if you're interested. And then the ethics, law, policy, and social implications. This is just an example of unawarded consequences of understanding racial divides through data that was initially thought to be quite harmless. This is blood spotting data that was publicly released leads to actual prevalence of, obviously from that you can actually determine prevalence of sickle cell, which actually says something about ethnic distributions. So, and obviously the Cambridge Analytica thing has got everybody sensitive to this. The Europeans have just introduced legislation. It's been in a 2-year period. It's actually coming into effect, which is why if you go to Google or Facebook, you will have noticed that you'll get a note saying their privacy settings or their privacy aspects have changed because they need to conform more closely with European law. So things are happening, but not at the speed at which data is being acquired and analyzed. So the conclusion to all of this is that is the notion that we're in this 4th paradigm. The 4th paradigm was actually something that was coined, a phrase that was coined by Jim Gray, who was a Turing Award winner. And it relates to the notion that we went through experimental, theoretical, experimental, computational phases of scholarly discourse, and now we're in a data-related phase, and that is likely to have pretty significant implications going forward as the amount of data and the tools and the technologies increase and improve. So that's it. Thank you.
Do we have any questions in the room? I don't see any on the chat.
There are, thank you for the talk. There are many applications currently in diagnostic to try to improve the diagnostic from imaging. In therapy, I mean, in physical therapies, what do you think would be the application of using large data in patient selections or in selecting adjusting the parameters to do the treatments?
I'm not quite sure the question you're asking, but in terms of physiotherapy, I mean, there's an ever-increasing body of data, for example, that shows different types of mobility. Maybe that's not what you're asking, but which is actually a lot of which is public. I mean, there's the Mobility Center at Stanford, and they're using that to actually define treatments by really analyzing back large amounts of video data of people's gait and other related things, which is helping define physiotherapy treatments. But I don't think that's what you're asking.
Physical therapies, I mean, for example, radiations or ultrasound.
I see.
In that case, it has a direct impact on the tissues that is almost, I would say, well known. If we speak in terms of for example, for focused ultrasound, it would be thermal damage, so we know exactly what would be the response. So how could we use those some massive data to improve the treatments? Is it more on the treatment itself or on patient selection?
Well, I think one would define the other, presumably, in a sort of feedback loop, right? So there's certainly the potential, if you have enough data and you've got enough, it could be images, but it could be other aspects of what happens when you apply radiation therapy, for example. Whatever you can actually measure from that, if you have enough data, you can begin to start to learn from it. What I didn't describe is, I don't know any examples that, so I'm sort of speaking hypothetically, but what you need is enough. So the idea of you can either select features and I don't think you're in a position to do this with what you're doing, but features can automatically be derived. So I can't, by virtue of characteristics of the data that you've measured, that you may not even think about. What that means, how that translates to what you're doing, I don't know, in terms of what you're measuring, when you apply ultrasound, focused ultrasound. But the example I am familiar with, which I think is something that's really going to happen in the next year or two, is, and I'm sorry, it's not in your field at all, but is the notion of structure prediction, okay, of protein structure prediction. So this is one of the holy grails of molecular biology, and I've been working on it myself on and off for a number of years. And we've got pretty good at it by conventional means by virtue of so-called homology modeling. So in other words, if you've got protein sequences, if they have a relationship that you can see and you can measure, then if the identity of those sequences is down to about 20 or 30%, then you know that the structures are very similar, and you can model to improve that. The problem is once you get below that, it turns out when you solve these structures, they're very similar. But you can't tell that by looking at the sequences. But we do know that the information is just in the sequence, because you can denature a protein, let it renature, and it will fold into the same way. So there are signals in those sequences, however disparate they are, that we have not yet been able to measure. And the question is whether these learning algorithms, these unsupervised learning algorithms, can actually discover these features. And this is something that Google's looking at in their London office right now with folks at UCL, based on the same DeepMind tools that they developed to work, that beat the best Go champion. So I'm sorry I don't have an example from your own field, but this is an example where the features might not be identifiable, and this is a particular case, but these are features that are not identifiable to the experts, at least now, as of today, yet they may be, some combination of them may be discovered in these algorithms. So the problem is that these things are kind of a black box, because you don't, even if it works, you don't know what those features are necessarily, more than likely.
So that's interesting, because in some case, for example, we for some patients, for brain treatment, it's very difficult to increase the temperature in the brain, and actually currently we don't know why, and so we could not identify the reason why it's so difficult for some patients, but with some analysis, we could maybe relate the result of the treatment to by using all the data we have on the patient, CT, MR, everything, see what would relate most to the outcome.
I mean, aggregating this data and putting it into one of these learning algorithms would be an interesting thing to try. I mean, that would be an interesting capstone project in its own right.
So what are the undergraduate backgrounds of the students in the data sciences graduate program?
There are prerequisites, things like linear algebra, basic statistics. But generally they come from different backgrounds. Some are directly out of undergraduates. Others have been working in different fields for a couple of years. And then, they come to do, they see this as a sort of stepping stone. So they come and they do the master's program. So they're a little all over the place. But because of the demands, the GPAs. We're now, of course, using data science to measure how well and how well. This is a whole other field. What you just described, in a sense, as precision medicine, is moving towards precision medicine. Is trying to aggregate enough data on an individual to modify the treatment based on their specific characteristics. We're also working with the Curry School of Education to try and do this with respect to precision education. That ultimately we'd be able to accumulate enough different types of data on a student to actually tailor, in principle, make recommendations about courses they should take, aspects of how they should learn. So this is a bit of a digression. We haven't got there yet. We're doing very simple things like that right now, like trying to understand correlations between what we're teaching and the jobs that the students ultimately get. But that was a long-winded way of saying that, I'd say there's quite a diverse population of students.
So how do you envision this transition to the academics that you mentioned? You mentioned the workforce of the poor of the private companies that have a lot of maybe most of your students working on this data analysis. We as academics, we don't have these resources. We often do our own statistical analysis, and we feel like dinosaurs doing ANOVA or old school statistics. But so, what's the plan to transfer this new way of thinking or these tools, analytical tools, to the academics, and how? Yeah.
Well, I think first of all we probably need to prove that this has any value at all. I mean, I can stand here and talk about it, but you're all nodding because no one's going to believe it unless it. So again, I come back to the capstones. That's one possibility. I mean, for a non-profit foundation, we only actually charge $5,000 to get 2 or 3 really smart students working on something for 8 months. I'd be happy to sit down and try and formulate a problem where you have data that. I mean, part of the issue in these projects is making sure that they have data, because if it can't be, well, we're going to have this data from these patients in next month because next month is 3 months, and that's not too. But those sort of logistical issues aside, that would be one way. We're also starting a PhD program, and I think what you're doing here is exciting enough to figure out a way. And some of you presumably have UVA appointments, so we could figure out a way to potentially. I'm actually going to change the way what we do with PhD students. Currently, we put actually about 25% of our budget per year in supporting fellowships for PhD students. And it's moderately effective, but I want to integrate them much more with the work of the master's students and make it a much more of a learning experience. Because these are presidential fellows, and what happens now is that they work together across disparate fields, which is good, around the data and analytics problem. But they're not really, they do that separate from the master's students, and it's not a good. I want to create, and I'm using this to create the beginnings of the PhD program. The point is that we could potentially look for student, so because the problem is with the masters, 8 months of doing this is not enough. They just get to the point of finding something useful, and then they drift off it. So we've actually been working on a whole, essentially a platform to sustain the analytics and the data that they've developed, so that other groups can pick it up very easily. But having a longer 3, 4, 5 year PhD thing would be stint would be obviously an advantage, and we certainly entertain that going forward if you had that kind of interest. That would instill, and it's fun to have. I don't know how much you interact with the UVA students right now, but it would be it's fun.
Thanks for your talk. In looking at analyzing big chunks of data, you mentioned there's kind of a couple of ways to do it. One is having a person who brings in their biases and what they're trying to find or what they're familiar with and looking for. And the other part is this machine that doesn't carry any of those biases, but also, can't relate what would be important to other people. When you weigh those two options in the work that you've done so far, have you been able to identify is one better than the other? I mean, I know both are going forward, but they really are going at it from two very different ways.
Well, my answer itself will be biased, partly because I didn't grow up with this stuff. I've just been learning it myself. I had a much more, just a different approach to things where everything was built on experience, and the idea that you could get a lot out of data without having a good understanding of that data was really problematic. And I still lean in that direction because for different, partly because it's my bias, but partly because what I see when I listen to at the end of the capstone projects, you can just see if the students have had really good mentoring on the subject matter from their mentors, generally the outcomes are significantly better than if they've kind of almost worked in an unsupervised way. And I mean that from an unsupervised learning way, by using the algorithms in an unsupervised way. So I think ultimately, and particularly for the complexity of things that we look at, and the example that you just described, I mean, I think you're just going to get nowhere without these. This is not a mecca. This is not, you really need the human intervention and the human expertise. So I would definitely lean in that direction for the kind of problems I imagine most of you have.
I have one last question, I guess. So now that these, in many areas of science, are these large data sets that are beginning to be available, and one of the obvious tools that people are using are unsupervised, deep learning kind of methods. There's huge opportunities there. Are there any particular dangers or concerns of trying to understand the complexities of large data sets with unsupervised learning, particularly if and when it begins to drive policy?
Well, I'm laughing because when you said that, the very last piece is I went over to the law school. So, because the DSI works across the institution, I've been all over the schools, just trying to figure out some of the things that are going on. When I went to the law school, I wasn't really expecting there to be much going on in the way of this kind of analytics, but I was very surprised. So there was actual interest in establishing a normativity center. Does anyone know what normativity is? So I didn't either. It's in Wikipedia. You can look it up. And basically, it's the evolution of rulemaking and what ultimately becomes rules turning. There's a sort of community gathering around a set of principles that then evolve into a sort of, perhaps unspoken policy that then becomes a written policy that then becomes a law. That's sort of the evolution that happens. And that, but the interesting thing is you can use various types of text mining to actually derive your rules from large corpora, like for example, all the text of the Supreme Court it's now all digital. They have it at the library in the law school. And you can start deriving laws from that. So, so the point is you could be at a point where actually a machine is defining a law. Now, you can see where that goes. The ethical considerations associated with that are huge. So almost anything, we teach a whole course on ethics. It's a landmark, not landmark, but it's a distinct, it's one of our, it's 20% of, I showed you those pillars, it's like 20% of our effort goes on getting the students to think about these types of issues. I'm sure if I'm answering your question, I forgot it, I've gone off on a tangent. But what surprised me in all of this is how different audiences react to different things. I'm going to test you now. I'm going to give you an example, okay? So I'm a student. I've just graduated from UVA. They give me a job with a lot of money, and it's in an online travel agency. And they've asked me to develop an algorithm that actually provides differential pricing based on the data that we have. So that data we have, we know when someone queries the system, we know pretty much where they are, what their location is. We also, if they actually sign up, we have other information about them. So we know their credit card number. We bought credit card information from Capital One or whoever it is. So we know their buying practices. So the idea is to come up with an algorithm that ultimately charges the person the most for that particular trip or whatever it is, that hotel room or whatever it is. Is that unethical? Who thinks? Yeah, I mean, you're being analyzed and you're being charged something different than some by virtue of data that they've collected on you. Is that ethical, or who thinks it's ethical?
Depends what you're advertising. What you're doing. I mean, if you're advertising like Trivago, come to us and we'll supervise all the sites and give you the best price for you. Then it's not ethical in my view, because you're not giving them the best price. You're giving them the highest price that they're willing to pay for the organization. But if you're saying we're going to we're just a site that's out there helping you buy stuff, and we're not advertising that we're going to give you the best price for you, then I think it's ethical to do it. But I think people very quickly learn that they can go to other places that will give them cheaper prices.
Well, maybe I'll make it simpler. If you're sitting here in Charlottesville and you query a price on a room, and you get a different price than you would if you were in Beverly Hills, is that ethical? It's never that simple. It's always a combination.
Whether it's ethical or not is not really relevant, because that's the way the world operates today. When I pull up to a vendor in my red Porsche, I get one price. When I pull up in the blue Subaru, I get a different price. That's true, but that doesn't necessarily that it still could be defined as an ethical question. It's just that we're not, which would imply we're not ethical if the answer. Right. Well, I mean, it may be unethical, but that's the way it is. So it really, yes, right. So it really comes down. Well, first of all, there is no simple answer to these sorts of things. So I learned three things, I guess. The first I learned there is no simple answer. The second thing I learned, there's nothing new in this. It's got nothing to do with technology and data mining and blah, blah, blah. The Sears Roebuck catalog actually had different pricing that they distributed in different areas, as did Victoria's Secret, when things used to go out in these catalog forms. So, it's been going on for a long time. And then where the nuances come in is with respect to how people feel about the amount of information that's going into making these decisions. And that's where there's a spectrum of different belief. And when I've done this sort of question in different types of audiences, it's interesting how different audiences react to it. I mean, the students were perfectly all right with it, effectively, which is a little disturbing. On the other hand, when I gave it to a bunch of bunch of middle managers in a data analytics company who were trying to weren't were involved in the industry, but were doing something that wasn't the analytics itself. They had a different viewpoint. So.
Well, thanks again to Dr. Bourne. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. Stay tuned to our newsletter and website for invitations to future webinars.
God, I really, the fact you resisted getting up for the pizza when I was waffling on about